world is defined in relation to the human, rather than the human being seen as part of and integral in a co-defining partnership. Because of this, she says, escape from dualized relationship and dualized identity represents a particularly difficult problem, a sort of a logical maze. Dualism then can be seen as a kind of alienated form of differentiation. She's not saying we must do away with differentiation. Clearly she's saying the logic of identity doesn't work. So it's about the way in which the distinctions are treated. Though the first, I'm going to have to just change my, here we go, change my note structure. So what is the structure? Oh, yeah, hold on a minute. On page 43, there's a whole list of ways in which the dualism and the dualist identity gets played out. I'm just scrolling down on my version of the book here. So she starts with culture, nature, reason and nature, male and female, mind, body, master, slave, reason, matter, all the way down, self, other, subject, object. In all these, the left-hand end, the left-hand side is the one that is valued, and the right-hand side is that which is defined in relationship to, in this dualistic splitting kind of format that she's trying to get us to say. So these are obviously genuine and important distinctions, but the way we treat them in Western society turns them into dualisms. And dualisms have particular structures, which she comes on to in a bit. So I'm just winding back again, if you'll excuse me. The logical structure of dualism. And the first one of these is backgrounding. Backgrounding is complex. For the master, let's talk about the master side, the left-hand side is the master side. He attempts to make use of the other, organising, relying on, benefiting from the other services, and then denying the dependency which this creates. So the master is in relation to the subordinate. The subordinate is essential to the identity, not just practically, but to the identity of the master. But the master, the form of the master, denies that this happens, this takes place. We deny dependency through making the other inessential by denying the importance of their contribution or even of their reality through mechanisms of focus and attention. The master decides that these areas are simply not worth noticing. We don't pay attention to how to cook. Men don't pay attention maybe to how to cook. They didn't traditionally, simply because this is a skill that isn't worth noticing, not worthy of the masculine. The fact that we all have to eat is beside the point. So there's a backgrounding, a denial of the relationship. And she goes into that with some examples for a bit. And the second feature of dualism is what she calls radical separation. Now here I'm on page 49. Because the other is to be treated not merely as different but inferior, part of a lower, different order of being, it's not about just distinctiveness, but what she calls this radical exclusion, not merely separation, but hyper-separation. The master tries to magnify, to emphasize, to maximize the number and importance of differences and to eliminate or treat as inessential shared qualities. And so, classically you might get, isn't it wonderful that the little deer can do it so well? That's a very typical, traditional, maybe hopefully old-fashioned nowadays, patriarchal statement, although we thought it was old-fashioned until we saw Trump. And this is in order to achieve maximum separation. I'm nothing like this inferior other, is the motto associated with radical exclusion. So that's the second characteristic of dualism. And then again, there's a long set of examples from different bits of literature as to how that works. The third characteristic she calls incorporation, or relational definition. The underside of the pair is conceived in relationship to the upper side as a lack, a negativity. And there's a quote from Simone de Beauvoir, presumably it's the second sex. Humanity is male, and man defines women not in herself but as relative to him. She's not regarded as an autonomous being. She's defined and differentiated with reference to man, and not he in reference to her. So we've already seen that. Humanity is defined within a masculine model. She is incidental, the inessential as opposed to the essential. He is the subject, he is the absolute, she is the other. So incorporation, there's a relative relational definition, and the relation is one of negativity, of devaluation. And out of that then comes instrumentalization. The subordinate becomes part of a network of purposes that are defined and harnessed in terms of the master side's purposes and needs, and the lower side's objectified without ends of its own which demand consideration on their own account. And stereotyping. In order to do all this, the dominating class has to see the other in a homogeneous way, and differences among the interiorized group are disregarded or minimized. I remember my friend, student Carlis, who I talked about at the residential, talking about the experience among Black British people of being seen to all look the same, which is one of those horrendous ways of homogenizing, inferiorizing that a racist society can do. So, several pages on, there's a whole section on the logic of dualism, which I think you should read, but at some stage, I'm not going to get into that in detail now. That is showing how, I think, mainly how the dualism comes down from a philosophically logical structure. And then on page 59, she comes round to talking about routes to escaping dualism. So if we've got a situation in which dualism is the fundamental thought structure, paradigmatic structure, which defines all forms of oppression, both within society and in human nature ones, what's the way out? And she's already told us that the way out is a maze. There's a strong temptation, once the role of dualism in creating exaggerated separation is perceived, to conclude that the resolution requires some sort of a merger, the elimination of a problematic boundary between one and the other, between the colonizer and the colonized. And this is just another way in which the colonized may adhere to the culture of the colonized. The colonized may adhere to the culture of the colonizer, lacking confidence to affirm a distinct identity. So the feminism of uncritical equality sees that answer to hyper-separation as fitting women to the masculine model. Well, that ain't going to work. And so she takes those 5 themes, this is on page 60, backgrounding, radical exclusion. So backgrounding, to counter backgrounding, we require a move to systems of thought accounting which recognize the contribution of both sides, which accept that there is a balance and a mutual dependency. Radical exclusion will affirm continuity rather than separation, will break away from the false choice hyperseparation. Incorporation must review the identities of both and discover a language and story for both sides, which is independent of the master side. Instrumentalization must see that the needs and values of both sides are interdependent. Homogenization, obviously, we stop thinking about all the people as being the same. We start to understand the complexity and diversion of other nations, other groups. But, she says, the escape routes are mazes containing mirrors, side tracks, loop trails and knots. Some of these we've already met in chapter 1, but there are other traps to turn aside the unwary pilgrim. A closer examination of these tracks and the way out of them will provide both a test and an explanation of some aspects of the theory of dualism I've outlined. And then she goes on to begin to talk about those traps. I'm not going to try to summarize all that. I'm just trying to give you some signposts. So what I take from this, and it's not easy to talk through, but what I take from this is that our identities and ways of thinking are formed by dualisms, and that those dualisms aren't simply about this and that, they're about a this and a that, which are hyper separated, so that the possibility of a continuum is really disturbing, is denied, and to let it come through is deeply disturbing. It's a mastery subordinate relationship, and in order to maintain that distance has to be continually created. And it's this structure of thinking with those different characteristics that I went through that holds everything in place, that stops us really making the shifts that so many of us would want to do so. And I think, just as an aside, and it may seem a little odd for a white heterosexual male to be saying this, but one of I think of the most significant shifts that we've seen around is the shifts around gender, because gender in a sense holds things together. What do we do when a baby's born? We usually say, is it a boy or is it a girl? And the gay and lesbian liberation movements, and more recently the transgender movement, I believe is really shaking this dualism in ways that are extraordinarily challenging for the people directly involved, but deeply disturbing for the mainstream culture. And it doesn't surprise me that people who have benefited from mainstream culture do get extraordinarily upset and discombobulated by this in ways that are dangerous in many ways, because these movements are upsetting a fundamental dualism on which our society has depended for hundreds, at least, years. If anybody's interested, I have a long article on the transgender movement, which was published in the London Review of Books, and then followed by, as you can imagine, a very interesting correspondence. So there we are. That's an introduction to Val Plumwood's book. You may find it challenging to read at times. It's certainly a philosophical book, but I think it's a really important, fundamental analysis of what holds stuff in place in Western society. Thank you very much.